The school sat at the edge of the town like a symbol people were proud of. Clean brick walls, wide windows, banners celebrating awards, and college acceptance rates. Parents talked about it like it was a guarantee. If your child went here, doors would open. Test scores were high. Funding was strong. Discipline was strict, but fair, at least on paper. It was the kind of place that sold itself as equal, as long as you fit what they quietly expected. For the black family arriving that fall, the school represented more than prestige. It represented relief. After years of weighing neighborhoods, touring districts, and calculating what they could afford without stretching themselves thin, this place felt like a finish line. They wanted their children to learn without fear, to walk halls where safety wasn't questioned, to be seen as students before anything else. The parents believed that if they did everything right, worked hard, followed the rules, stayed involved, the system would meet them halfway. The first morning felt hopeful. New backpacks, fresh notebooks, nervous excitement that filled the car as they pulled into the drop-off lane. The children sat upright in their seats, eyes wide, taking in the size of the building, the crowds of students pouring in. Teachers stood outside with clipboards and practiced smiles. From the outside, it looked welcoming, organized, calm. But even then, small things stood out. Some parents watched a little longer than necessary. Conversations paused, then restarted once the family passed. It wasn't hostility. It was assessment. The kind that happens quietly, where no one thinks they're doing anything wrong. The children didn't notice at first. The parents did. Inside, the halls buzzed with noise and movement. Lockers slammed. Shoes squeaked against polished floors. Posters lined the walls, celebrating diversity in bright colors and bold words. It all looked right. But as the family moved through the space, they felt it, that subtle sense of being out of sync, like the rhythm of the place wasn't built with them in mind. The principal watched from a distance that morning. He had been in education long enough to read rooms quickly. He noticed who blended in easily and who carried themselves more carefully. He saw the family enter, saw the way the parents stayed close to their children, saw the way attention followed them without anyone admitting it. He didn't intervene. Not yet. First days always came with nerves. He filed the observation away out in the classroom. The children took their seats. Teachers spoke warmly, outlining expectations, routines, rules. Everything sounded fair, equal. Still, the children felt it, the way questions lingered just a bit longer when they spoke, the way their answers were double-checked, the way attention sharpened instead of softened. Nothing overt, nothing you could point to, just enough to make you sit straighter. By the end of the day, the parents asked the usual questions. How was school? Did you like your teacher? Make any friends? The answers were polite, measured. It was fine. It's nice. But the excitement from the morning had dulled. Something had shifted, even if no one could name it yet. That night, as the house settled into quiet, the parents talked softly in the kitchen. They told themselves it was just the first day. New places took time. Not every pause meant something. Not every look was loaded. They wanted to believe that. They needed to dot outside. The school lights dimmed, standing tall and calm against the dark sky. From the outside, it still looked like opportunity, like progress, like a place built on fairness. Inside its walls, however, the rules of belonging were already being tested. The first incident didn't arrive with shouting or open insults. It came quietly, wrapped in routine, the way injustice often does when it expects to go unnoticed. A week into the school year, one of the children was pulled aside in the hallway during lunch. A staff member asked to check their backpack. No explanation at first, just procedure, delivered with a tone that suggested this was normal. Other students walked past without slowing down, backpacks untouched, eyes forward. The child froze for a moment, confused more than afraid, then complied. Nothing was found. The staff member nodded and sent them on their way without apology. By the end of the day, the same thing had happened to another black student. Then another. Word spread quietly among the kids, not as outrage, but as warning. Keep your hands visible. Don't joke too loudly. Don't run in the halls. Don't draw attention. The children adjusted without being told to, absorbing the lesson faster than any adult realized. In the classroom, expectations began to shift in subtle ways. Mistakes that earned gentle reminders from other students came with firmer correction when they made them. Questions they asked were met with skepticism instead of encouragement. When group work was assigned, they were chosen last more often than not, left standing a moment too long while others paired up quickly. The teachers never said anything openly wrong. That was the problem. Everything could be explained away. Everything had a reason. Classroom management, school policy, maintaining order, but patterns don't need permission to exist. The parents noticed. When emails started coming home, small notes about behavior, about tone, about concerns that felt vague but heavy. Nothing that warranted punishment. Just enough to establish a record. Just enough to create a narrative. They requested a meeting. The meeting was polite, professional, the kind that smiled while delivering discomfort. Administrators reassured them that the school treated all students equally. That staff were trained. That concerns were taken seriously. When the parents asked why their children were being singled out for searches, the answer was careful. We don't target students. We respond to situations. What situations, exactly? Remained unclear. The parents left the meeting with no resolution and a familiar ache. In their chest, the feeling of having spoken clearly and still not been heard. Of having to prove harm in a system that required harm to be loud before it was acknowledged. The children felt the shift immediately after. Teachers watched them more closely now. Not out of care, but caution. The kind that assumed trouble before it appeared. The kind that turned normal childhood behavior into potential disruption. The message was subtle but consistent. You are being monitored. One afternoon, a group of parents stood near the pickup area talking openly, voices casual and unguarded. One of them laughed and said, "This school just isn't built for certain kids," followed by a nod toward the building. Another replied, quieter but clear enough, "Yeah, some kids just don't belong here." The children heard it. So did other parents. No one corrected it. That was the first blow, not a single comment or action. But the realization that exclusion didn't need to be enforced loudly when it was already understood. That the system didn't need to push them out directly. It only needed to remind them, again and again, that they were guests in a space that claimed to be neutral. The children went home that day quieter than usual. And for the first time, the parents wondered whether doing everything right would ever be enough. The change didn't happen all at once. It settled in slowly, threading itself through daily routines until it became impossible to separate what was normal from what was harmful. At home, the children stopped talking as freely about school. When asked how their day went, their answers grew shorter, less detailed. Fine, okay, nothing much. It wasn't that nothing was happening. It was that they were learning instinctively that sharing came with weight. That their parents' faces tightened when certain topics surfaced. That worry followed honesty too closely. One of the children began double-checking their backpack every morning, making sure nothing could be misinterpreted. Another started asking if it was okay to speak up in class before raising their hand, seeking permission where confidence used to live. These weren't behaviors taught. They were absorbed. The parents noticed the shift and felt the familiar pull inward, the urge to protect by minimizing. They debated whether to push harder or pull back, whether drawing attention to the problem would make things worse. Whether silence, once again, was being mistaken for safety. Late at night, the mother lay awake, replaying moments from her own childhood. Classrooms where her intelligence had been questioned before it was tested. Principals' offices where she had been asked to explain herself more carefully than others. She had promised herself her children would never feel that same quiet erosion of confidence. Now, she wasn't sure how to stop it. The father carried the conflict differently. He felt it in restraint, in the way he measured his words during meetings, in the way he chose calm, even when anger would have been justified. He worried constantly about consequences, how easily concern could be reframed as aggression, how quickly advocacy could be labeled disruption. Isolation crept in from all sides. Other parents were friendly, but distant. Conversations stayed light, never touching the tension everyone seemed to sense, but no one named. Invitations came less often. Playdates drifted away quietly, without explanation. The family wasn't rejected outright. They were simply not included. That invisibility hurt, more than confrontation would have. The children felt caught between two truths. At home, they were encouraged to be confident, curious, expressive. At school, those same qualities felt risky. The contradiction was exhausting. Slowly, they began choosing silence where curiosity once lived, compliance where creativity used to breathe. School environment hadn't changed its rules. It had changed its expectations. And the hardest part wasn't the prejudice itself, was the way it encouraged self-doubt, the way it pushed the family to question their own perceptions, to wonder if they were being too sensitive, too reactive, too loud about something that was easier for everyone else to ignore. That internal conflict did real damage, because when injustice becomes something you carry alone, it doesn't just isolate you from others, it begins to separate you from yourself. And that was the space the family now occupied. Quiet, watchful, uncertain. But isolation, when it stretches long enough, does something else too. It prepares the ground for change. The spark didn't come from confrontation. It came from being seen. It happened on an ordinary morning, the kind that blended into every other school day. The children stood in line outside the building, backpacks slung over their shoulders, faces neutral in a way that had become too practiced. The mother watched from a distance, noticing how closely they stayed together now, how their laughter faded the closer they got to the doors. That was when another parent stepped closer. She didn't lower her voice. She didn't look around first. She simply stood beside the mother and said she'd noticed the change too. The quiet, the distance, the way certain children were watched more closely than others. She admitted she hadn't spoken up before, not because she didn't care, but because she hadn't known how. That honesty mattered. Cracked something open. Soon, another parent joined the conversation. Then another. Each shared small observations, things that seemed insignificant alone, but formed a pattern when placed side by side. Disciplinary notes that felt uneven. Comments brushed off as jokes. Expectations placed on some children, but not others. The family realized they hadn't been imagining it. They hadn't been alone. Support didn't arrive loudly. There were no petitions, no social media posts, just quiet solidarity that grew stronger with each shared truth. Parents began sitting together at events instead of separating by habit. They asked questions during meetings that had never been asked before. They listened more carefully when concerns were raised instead of dismissing them as misunderstandings. The children felt it first. One afternoon, a teacher paused before redirecting one of them and chose a different approach. Another day, a classmate defended them casually, without drama, as if fairness were the obvious response. These moments were small, but they carried weight. They told the children something important, that they were worth defending, even when they weren't in the room at home. The atmosphere shifted too. The parents spoke more openly now, not just about fear, but about strategy, about documenting patterns, about knowing policies, about understanding the difference between making noise and making change. They weren't preparing for a fight. They were preparing to stand their ground. And then came the ally who changed everything. The principal requested a meeting, not after a complaint, but after listening, after noticing attendance patterns, after reviewing discipline data more closely. The invitation wasn't defensive. It was deliberate. In that meeting, the family didn't raise their voices. They didn't accuse. They described experiences, shared timelines, explained how subtle moments accumulated into something heavy and harmful. They spoke about the cost of silence, not just to their children, but to the culture of the school itself. The principal listened. Really listened. And in that moment, something rare happened. Authority didn't close ranks. It leaned in. The family left the meeting without promises, but with something just as important: acknowledgement. A commitment to review practices, to address bias directly instead of pretending neutrality was enough. To protect children not by controlling them, but by understanding them. The spark had caught, not because the system had fixed itself, but because someone inside it had chosen courage over comfort. The tension in the air hadn't disappeared. If anything, it had sharpened. Change always did that. It unsettled those who relied on silence to stay in control. Everyone could feel it. Now, something was coming. The stand didn't arrive suddenly. It arrived the way storms do after the air grows too still. After pressure builds so quietly that people convince themselves nothing is wrong. It came on a day meant to celebrate the school. Parents filled the auditorium for an open assembly. Folding chairs lined in neat rows. Children seated by grade level. Teachers standing along the walls. Posters about belonging and community hung from the ceiling, their words bright and hopeful. From the outside, it looked like unity. But tension moved underneath it all. The family sat together, shoulders squared, aware of eyes that lingered longer than they should. They weren't imagining it anymore. They had learned to trust that instinct. Around them, some parents whispered. Others avoided looking in their direction entirely. A few offered small nod, includes quiet signs of support. It said, "We see you." Then it happened. A presentation shifted to discipline standards and school culture. Numbers appeared on a screen: detentions, behavioral notes, classroom removals. The explanation stayed neutral, polite, carefully worded, but the data told a different story. Certain groups were being singled out. Certain children watched more closely, corrected more often, removed more quickly. The room grew uncomfortable, though no one said why. That was the moment. The principal stood. There was no dramatic pause, no raised voice, just a calm step forward, grounded and deliberate. The room quieted not because they were told to, but because something real was about to be said. The principal acknowledged the pattern plainly, not defensively, not vaguely. Directly. They spoke about how bias didn't always arrive as cruelty. It arrived as assumption, as lowered expectations, as discipline framed as concern. They spoke about how children learned quickly when they were being tolerated instead of welcomed, and how silence from leadership didn't protect anyone. It enabled harm. The air shifted. Some parents shifted uncomfortably. Others leaned forward. Teachers glanced at one another, aware that this wasn't a general statement. It was a reckoning. The principal made it clear that the school would not be a place where children were sorted by fear or expectation. That belonging was not conditional. That any child, regardless of race, had the right to learn without being treated as a problem waiting to happen. Then came the line that changed everything. They stated, calmly and without hesitation, that black kids belonged here not as guests, not as exceptions, but as equals. And anyone who couldn't accept that would need to adjust. Not the children. Silence followed. Not awkward silence. Accountable silence. The family felt it in their chest. Not relief, not triumph, but grounding. The kind that comes when truth is finally spoken aloud by someone with the power to back it up. This wasn't a defense. It was a line. Drawn. The power dynamic shifted in real time. The whispers stopped. The certainty that some parents had carried cracked. The unspoken permission to exclude dissolved under clarity. The children didn't fully understand the speech, but they felt the change. The weight lifted just enough for them to breathe. The stand wasn't loud, but it was undeniable, and nothing would be the same after it. The days after the assembly felt quieter, not because nothing was happening, but because something had finally settled into place. The school didn't transform overnight. Hallways were the same. Class schedules didn't change. Morning announcements still echoed through the building like they always had. But the atmosphere shifted in ways that were hard to miss. If you were paying attention, teachers became more careful with their words. Not fearful, intentional. Discipline was handled with explanation instead of assumption. Children who had once been watched too closely were now simply allowed to be children. Mistakes were treated as part of learning, not proof of character. The family noticed it first in small moments. Their child came home, talking about class projects instead of classroom tension. About teachers who asked questions instead of issuing warnings. About friends who no longer whispered who belonged where. The shoulders that once stayed tense after school relaxed again. Laughter returned, unguarded and loud. For the parents, dignity came quietly. No apology was ever delivered directly. None was needed. What mattered more was consistency, the absence of suspicion, the presence of fairness. The feeling that their children were no longer being measured against a shadow they didn't create. Other families noticed too. Some parents who had once kept their distance began conversations at pickup. Others acknowledged, without explanation, that they had learned something. Not everyone grew comfortable immediately, but discomfort no longer dictated policy, behavior, or silence. The principal didn't revisit the speech. They didn't need to. The message had already taken root. Expectations were clear now. Belonging wasn't up for debate. And leadership had shown that it wasn't afraid to protect children, even when doing so challenged adults. For the family, the victory wasn't public recognition or praise. It was peace. Peace in knowing they hadn't imagined the harm. Peace in knowing they hadn't stayed silent. Peace in knowing their children would remember this school, not as the place they were pushed out, but as the place where someone stood up and said, "You matter here." The experience reshaped them all. The parents carried forward a deeper confidence, not loud, not performative, but steady. The kind that comes from witnessing accountability work. The children carried something even more powerful, proof that authority could be used to protect, not exclude. And the school carried a lesson it wouldn't forget, that racism didn't always arrive shouting, that injustice often hid behind rules and routines. And that change didn't require outrage, only courage, clarity, and the willingness to speak when silence felt easier. They had said black kids didn't belong here. The principal had disagreed. And by doing so, changed far more than a moment. They changed the future of every child who walked those halls knowing they were seen, protected, and worthy.